What's going on, everybody? Here bring you this video to discuss the draft possibilities of the one and only Kadyn Proctor in the upcoming 2026 draft. We're going to rewind his career at Alabama, see how we got to this point where he is slated to go in the first round of the NFL draft, and discuss a team that to me seems like a place where it does seem like a fail-proof situation, or at least the team that would give him the best odds to be very successful at the next level. So with that said, let's roll into the video. Okay, so to start off, I think it would be a good idea to give a description of what Kadyn Proctor is as a player. He is a 6'7", 352-pound offensive lineman that hails from Des Moines, Iowa. He is a behemoth of a man and an absolute anchor when it comes to his play. Has shown flashes of just how athletic he is for his size, as I'm sure everyone saw the packages this season where he got the ball on a few occasions for the Alabama offense, where he was living a lineman's dream. A guy that once he puts his hands on you, and if he can get square and put his power behind them, for the most part, defensive guys are out of there. He has monstrous power. He's plenty strong, which follows the profile and lineage of many Alabama linemen that have been there in the past. So coming out of high school, Kadyn Proctor was a consensus five-star athlete and was ranked among the top 10 players overall in the country. Coming in, he was listed at 6'7", 330 pounds. So on the surface, seemed physically ready to be able to play at a top program like Alabama and put up with the SEC grind, as he was tipping the scales a little over what the average SEC and even NFL tackle was weighing in at relative to that height. He held and lived up to his five-star pedigree, as he would see the field very early as a freshman, and essentially get thrown into, probably the hardest position among the O-line in terms of pass protection at left tackle. For the most part, this was really the only spot open for competition, as other spots were already taken. You had Tyler Booker and J.C. Latham playing left guard and right tackle respectively. Both guys went first. They were first-round picks in the NFL. And you had upperclassmen like Seth McLaughlin playing at center, and you had Jaden Roberts, who eventually won the job at right guard. So he slotted in there, at left tackle, really because that was just kind of the position where Alabama was mostly shaky at, and a position, he was coming out of tackle. He was listed as a tackle. And he showed flashes his freshman year, but there were definitely peaks and valleys during his first year. One thing that was clear on tape was that if he got his hands on you, like, he was just stoning guys. I think that one of the biggest question marks was him getting beat by edge defenders, and more so getting to the point of the attack for him to use that power. He kind of struggled with speed, which is something to be expected given his physical build, and the fact that once the season came around, he was tipping the scales around 360 pounds, so 30 pounds, heavier than he had already came in as a freshman, now being in a college strength and conditioning program. Both tackles at Alabama, Kadyn Proctor and J.C. Latham were at 360 pounds, and this would be very evident as the range of tackles, height and weight-wise, can be between 6'4" to 6'8", and around that 205, 225-pound range. And the size difference that we had at Alabama compared to what's in the NFL and what's in the SEC was very apparent, during the storming and rainy USF game down in Miami, down in 2024. It was just a great indicator of the size difference, as when you're heavier, it's harder to move and get to the spot and play in space. It's good that these guys have the power that they have, but they have to be able to put it to use and get their hands on guys. And this was really exploited by USF's nickel corner. He just kind of kept running past, our protection, our blocking from blitzes and penetration, especially when we were in more condensed formations. They would just kind of send him, and he really did a great job of, getting penetration and living in the backfield with just pure speed, really. And another thing to consider about nickel corners is that they're even wider than edge players, and it makes the matchup versus a tackle have that much more space to work with. The battle's no longer, like in the phone booth, where a build by an Alabama tackle shines, like Kadyn Proctor. So going against speed was always going to be an issue when you peel back the layers and look from a physical standpoint level, especially that game just really solidified it because nickel corners aren't guys that really specialize in terms of pass rushing moves. They have more coverage responsibilities, and yeah, they do have to plug in, but you're not as refined in a pass rushing technique role as you are an edge defender because you're not asked to do that all the time. But whenever they would send him, he had like it. I thought at first he was an edge guy even before starting this video simply because of his stat line. I mean, I think he had like a plethora of TFLs. I believe he had like a couple sacks in there, like, just kind of the most productive guy, especially even by like defensive lineman statistics, So, I mean, I think that just that player, a nickel corner, you think kind of anywhere from that, 5'10", to maybe 6'1", 6'2", even 6'3", but for sure, lighter bodies, usually not a guy that's going to be over 230 pounds. And so really what they do have to rely on is just kind of speed and having that runway to win. And you saw this throughout the season. I think you saw it a couple times in the Rose Bowl where we would get beat by speed. There in Nick Saban's last season, but for sure, I think that nothing kind of points to how much of a struggle speed was like that game in particular. But for whatever reason, even though he struggled against, I feel like he was a little bit inconsistent in terms of when we played smaller teams. It just kind of really brought that flaw out. But against and that makes sense because, you're talking about guys who they're not the biggest program, they don't have the best, recruiting pedigree. So they have to really rely on edge guys that are a little bit more springy and faster, rather than these big 5-star, power rushers that big programs are getting, the 5-star rushers that, big colleges have, they're power rushers and they're explosive, but they're not just going to try to run past you on every single down. And I think that he played well in most of his big games, against other big programs. I think for the most part, he always had a good to solid game. I think that that's best identified, when he played against a team like Georgia, Georgia obviously has done a really good job on the defensive line, and specifically the matchups against Michael Williams and Jelon Walker. This kind of marks a big correlation to me because if you're kind of following along, it's like when you play smaller teams and smaller teams are going to rely solely on speed to kind of get penetration. But when you play big teams, especially Georgia, you'll definitely have powerful guys and run stoppers. If there's anything a Georgia defensive lineman can do, it's, stop the run and power rush, as they haven't really had a true speed guy since, Nolan Smith went to the NFL. And that power to power matchup is exactly the kind of battle that Kadyn Proctor excels at. He was able to fight in the pocket, and fight in the phone booth, make it power versus power, and Jelon Walker and Michael Williams, mind you, first round picks had pretty quiet games, by their standards versus Alabama and Kadyn Proctor, those guys, if you watch them go against Texas, they just completely destroyed, the game plan. And whenever they played Alabama, we seemingly did a good job of just kind of keeping them out of the backfield and, keeping their impact on the game as minimal as possible. And to me, that's a correlation that I found that whenever he played, kind of these power to power guys, not the guys that really need a runway, he played very well. But whenever we line up, against teams that had just that springy guy, that guy that was just fast, sometimes it was an area of concern. So that was his freshman year, and now we transition to his sophomore year, where Kadyn Proctor had to make a choice in the offseason as Nick Saban had just retired from Alabama. He initially chose to hit the transfer portal. So just, keeping in mind, the timeline up to this point, he comes in his freshman year, probably, a few pounds overweight, and actually gains weight through just being in a college strength program. He goes the whole season, from fall camp in August to the end of the season in January. He has a bit of a hiatus, not knowing where he's going to play at in the fall. It takes him a little while to figure out, where he was going to go to school as he double dipped in the portal, because he initially, said he was going to transfer from Alabama to Iowa, then, from Iowa back to Alabama. So, sophomore season, spring camp starts, goes through the summer for a month or two, back to fall camp in the beginning of the season. Uh, so, through all that time, he's kind of going through this, and he begins as a starter once again, to begin the season. And when it comes to going into the season and we start playing, I believe it was the fourth or fifth game against USF at home in 2024. He gets hurt in the pregame, which essentially keeps him out for a few games. And I'm sure, that injury impacted his ability to practice and really get his body right to perform. He ends up coming back during the season and finishes it out, heading into the top of 2025. So, a little bit of a busy off season there. A lot of things to contemplate. Nick Saban retiring, not really knowing where he's going to go to school, and all that. And also, just that off season just coming in, you talk about having a brand new coach and different philosophies and having to adapt to all that. It's just really busy off seasons for this guy. Really after his freshman year, but again, he decides to come back. Does get hurt sometime in the season. That kind of takes time, away from being able to prep and what have you. And he finishes the year off, and then we transition to his junior year. So in his junior year, prior to the start of the season, we heard rumblings, and then confirmed that he was being kept out of practices in the spring, and I think a bit in fall camp, as he continued to nurse an injury where he can't really do anything besides really just recover. This gets in the way of the plan to drop a bit of weight, and really gives him, a tough time being able to do that, because dropping the weight, I think would really give him the platform to kind of put the talent all together, and, solidify what we think is, him being one of the best, one of the one of the greatest tackles in the country. Because the flashes and, waves of consistency would pop out. But now for his junior year, it was time to really iron out the inconsistencies and go from showing these flashes to, a guy who's going to be reliable and always show up and, be a kind of player that's always going to show, his best. Him being hurt really limit what he could do. In the off season, you're not working as much and getting physical exercise done. And then I believe it was in, fall camp, he reports back with a weight gain. It was either fall or spring camp. He kind of actually goes what his weight ends up trending the opposite, and he kind of gains a few pounds. And this is and this weight gain, I think, essentially is what leads to the packages of him getting the ball from what we saw. I'm not 100% sure on this, but from what I've heard, it was done as a reward system, where essentially he was doing, extra work and trying to get his body right. So they were rewarding him with, giving him the ball and using him as a skilled player, which is, quite creative from his point of view and the coaching staff point of view. But it was never going to be 100% effective, because really what I do want to iterate is just how hard this is to do during the season. These guys are practicing, film prepping basically every day of the week and getting ready for travel and game day on Saturday. You have to recover on Sunday and start the week off again, and start the process of practicing and film prepping. And on top of just juggling classes and now the attention and the NIL world, it is hard to be able to, perfectly it's hard to get in perfect condition, to play on Saturday and have to have a, physical body change, like dropping weight. If anybody has ever tried to gain or lose weight, it's not something where you can just say, yeah, I'm going to go, from 200 pounds to 150 pounds, in a week. It's a very slow process, and we have to give credit to the coaching staff and Kadyn Proctor for, trying their best to make it happen. It was just something that was going to be completely impossible to fix, going from 360 plus pounds, to, the even the prototypical tackle weight, from 310 to 325. But, everyone would have loved to see him kind of drop a little bit of weight just because it would have really optimized his play. Change his body, and it would have given him, the best platform to work with. I think that Kadyn Proctor getting down to 345 or 340 would hope get the best out of him, as I just feel like he's just one of those guys that are just naturally going to be, bigger. When you look at him, he doesn't look bad. It's not, he plays lineman, obviously, so he's a big dude, but it doesn't look like it's, this unhealthy, weight where he's just carrying bad weight. I would say that he looks solid and appropriate for what you want out of a tackle, and unpacking his career also helps give the idea that I think he just simply did not have time, to really iron out this part of his game. I think that when you look at weight loss, you can kind of, categorize it in a quote unquote individual goal. But again, just to kind of, reiterate, I just feel like the guy just didn't have enough time. Is you have to keep in mind that he was the number one guy at left tackle since he came into the program. He didn't have a redshirt year where he could really just focus and develop, that part of his game. And this is not something that you're going to fix in a matter of, 4 weeks. The already loaded schedule of a college athlete and the setbacks that he suffered in the off seasons just before his sophomore and junior years did not give him enough time to address this issue in terms of, if anyone's asking, well, why not address it in the off season? And I know that for a lot of people, this is an area of concern at the next level, the way it is. And look, this isn't even going to the, transition that should have already been happening. This isn't even looking into the transition of, the O-line at Alabama. There was a transition that, should have taken place because I think definitely the O-line at Alabama was a little bit heavier, even when Nick Saban was there. And it kind of has to get jump started by Kalen DeBoer and the new staff coming in. To sum it up, for the longest, a prototypical Alabama tackle was not really ready to handle the transition of an air raid offense that Alabama became, since really 2022. Before we were a heavy, run team, and we had the RPO scheme after that, with Tua and Jalen Hurts and Mac Jones, but with a pass-heavy coaching staff coming in. And getting, Kadyn Proctor in the middle of his collegiate career, he had to play more of a heavy role in pass protection in terms of the reps than what maybe he was used to with the old coaching staff. So he was kind of getting built away where he was, not going to have, he was not going to have as many pass protection reps as he did when Kalen DeBoer and company came in. So he was essentially, caught in the middle of a change, a revolution of the O-line where the philosophy and ask for alignment became completely different from years prior. And, I'll have a video, just kind of a deeper breakdown on Alabama's O-line and how it transitioned from, Nick Saban's, even earlier days to now Kalen DeBoer's, offense, because this is also, to me, Marks, is heavily significant. And I think it'll go in to Alabama and, what their success could look like in the future. But how all this matters to Kadyn Proctor summed up is that he just simply, to me, he didn't have adequate time to address this, as the windows to do it in the offseason were always, put short and limited after his freshman year. Injuries, portal decisions made it worse. Being the starter since you're a freshman, it makes you have a higher degree of responsibility to serve the quote unquote team aspects of the game rather than something that, weight loss can be categorized as an individual go on the surface. This is something that, like I said, it's not going to be done in 2 weeks. And, he's already began to address it. Now that he's declared for the draft and, he can be selfish in this time of working up to the draft and work on this individual goal. He's weighing 352. At the combine, he weighed in at 352, there to open up the month of March. And it's something that signals, his hunger, and intent to be professional and address the issues at hand. He's already plenty strong and would probably be the strongest guy on the field, even at 300 pounds. So this is why it would benefit tremendously to find a better and healthy playing weight for him. Because even though I know 360 pounds is not his, that's not the best platform, that doesn't mean that we need to go to the other end of the spectrum and bring him down to 310 pounds. Because he needs to feel good. And like I said, having a healthy playing weight where, he doesn't look drained or he lacks that, power and explosion that he has, To me, a unique way personalized for a unique athlete as Kadyn Proctor, who was plenty of athletic at 360 pounds. But at 360 pounds, we're talking about, his position is usually going up against the best athlete on the field, which is usually between, 260 to 200, in that 260 and 280 range, in terms of like the edge guys of the world, the Max Crosby's of the world, the Miles Garrett's of the world, the Michael Parsons of the world. So being athletic at 360 pounds is completely different from being athletic at 270 pounds. Bearing all this and, a rather turbulent college career, when, looking at it and unpacking it, he still showed enough to be a first round pick and show that he is among the top tackles in the draft while, not coming close to being a, complete, polished prospect. Now changing gears to which team should take him. There's one team that I have no doubt in my mind is a much better fit than any other team, and that being the Philadelphia Eagles. Now I know it might sound like an obvious or cherry picking thing to say, given the success that the Eagles had a couple seasons ago, and maybe someone will even say this kind of comes down to a pipeline pick as the Eagles have loaded up on Alabama players, and especially with this, it would especially load up, on the offensive line. But the reason for this pick kind of comes down to two factors. And we have already kind of talked and gone over a little bit and mentioned, what the NFL prototypical tackle looks like in terms of height and weight. And if you look at Kadyn Proctor's height and weight, it is significantly different from what other tackles' height and weight are. Kadyn Proctor will be an outlier and an exception, to the norm of what, the height and weight is in the NFL. There really isn't a player with a similar build to him, all except one, that being Jordan Mailata, of the Philadelphia Eagles. Jordan Mailata, from a physical build perspective, is the only other guy in the NFL that correlates well with Kadyn Proctor, as he himself is, 6'8", 365 pounds. Given the fact that he is also an ex-rugby player, shows how athletic he is. And at the very least, probably developed a better ability to tumble and be nimble, as rugby is a more fluid and mobile game, more moving parts than football, where the plays in football, our plays are, stop and go. Football doesn't free flow as you would explode for the max that you can explode for, on a play are 20 seconds, if even that. Then the play stops, you reset, and then you do it again. Rugby naturally builds a less robust style of movement. Like I said it before, I think Kadyn Proctor is very athletic for his size, but it won't really shine, or it will easily go unnoticed, as naturally even the most athletic left tackle better be towards the bottom of the rankings in terms of observable athleticism when compared to the rest of the players on the field, especially the skilled players. But for a tackle, and especially at that size, both guys have great athleticism. These guys aren't just tanks. That being said, Kadyn Proctor to the Eagles would be perfect because he would not have the pressure of being a starter, right away, bearing injury. Jordan Mailata and Lane Johnson would start at both tackles positions. This would give Kadyn Proctor probably, the best mentor he could specifically ask for with Jordan Mailata. If I'm the Eagles, I'm wanting Jordan Mailata to take Kadyn Proctor under his wing and really, have them lab it up together because, like I said, very unique profiles, very unique players when compared to other tackles in the NFL. So this also probably translates to their technique. Jordan Mailata is one of the best tackles in the NFL. And I would bet that there are things that he does I would bet that there's things in his game that he does a little bit differently compared to other tackles in the NFL just due to having to move at that size. Just small subtle things, the small little details, but maybe it's pivoting your foot a second or two earlier in certain positions, engaging a D lineman from a certain angle, that makes, sense for their build, their unique build, maybe rather than the conventional way that it's taught through drills and taught through O-line coaches. I'm no O-line expert, but if I just had to guess, I would imagine that, this happens. And, you would want Kadyn Proctor to kind of pick up all those nuances and pick up all those nuggets that he could from Jordan Mailata. As Jordan Mailata is among, the best tackles at the hardest level of football in the NFL. Kadyn Proctor absorbing that knowledge and that correlation, of moving a certain way during plays under the guidance of Jordan Mailata would correlate and translate. It would correlate and translate so well because it's two guys that understand and have, relatability when it comes to playing at a heavier size than what most people do at that position. Playing situation would be the other factor and kind of, the path to the field. Like I said, Kadyn Proctor being a first round pick, if he were to get taken away, by the Eagles, you can expect instant impact. But in the event that you don't need him to give you instant impact, with Lane Johnson's retirement kind of lingering and being a topic and, something that the Eagles will eventually have to address and prep for, you can take Kadyn Proctor there, in the first round. And I think Kadyn Proctor being able to learn from two of the best tackles in the NFL, where, even though there's less of a translation from Lane Johnson's skill set to Kadyn Proctor's skill set, you can still pick up great information and tips, from a guy who is, more than likely a Hall of Famer. Inheriting the position, can be a seamless transition if Kadyn Proctor can bring it all together and become the tackle that we think he can be. And also it'll probably benefit him, just kind of being on that right side where, he's in the field of vision of the quarterback. That would be very helpful for Jalen Hurts. While Kadyn Proctor ends up, developing and ironing out his pass rushing, technique, his pass protection technique. In the event that for whatever reason Kadyn Proctor, cannot work out at either tackle position, we have already seen the Eagles take a player who was in a similar situation as Kadyn Proctor, from a physical standpoint, in Mekhi Becton, and turn him into a very effective and strong interior lineman. Mekhi Becton was a first-round pick for the Jets. He had a very similar build to Kadyn Proctor, as he was a bit oversized for the tackle position. He came to the NFL being, 6'7" and 364 pounds. And he eventually, he struggles with the Jets, almost kind of gets called a bust before having a resurgence season at the Eagles. Mekhi Becton was part of the offensive line that led that crazy rushing attack in season from Saquon Barkley and helped the Eagles be balanced on offense to win a Super Bowl, which eventually led to, Becton getting acquired and paid by the Los Angeles Chargers. If Kadyn Proctor cannot start on the outside to the Eagles' liking, you can give him the Mekhi Becton pathway and have a strong interior piece where a lot of people think that maybe he, should have been an interior piece, but that being said, when he comes to Alabama, due to requisite height and length for, the tackle position, Alabama needing a starter at left tackle his freshman, year, it's kind of the position where he competes once he gets to Alabama. And, really, for linemen, it's all about that's the premier position. If you're a lineman and you can potentially play left tackle, that's the position you want to play because it's just a premier position amongst the O-line in terms of, getting paid. Kadyn Proctor could slide inside and move to guard, and if he doesn't work out on the outside, and the Eagles are very versatile, inside with, Landon Dickerson, Cam Jurgens and Tyler Steen, being able to play on either the left or right side. And, specifically, Jurgens and Dickerson have positional versatility, being able to play, center or guard. So considering all the pathways to the field for Kadyn Proctor, at the Eagles, it would make a lot of sense for all parties involved, as it would be as fail-proof as can be. Given the Eagles' offense that also isn't, the heaviest drop back to pass and, just kind of pass you to death type of offense, it also works to Kadyn Proctor's strengths, as the offensive line is asked to, maul guys around and open lanes for the rushing threats of, Jalen Hurts and Saquon Barkley, and have an overall greater responsibility in the run game. The linemen have a greater responsibility, in the run game naturally, just because the Eagles are probably running the ball a lot more than most teams do in the NFL. So when you run the ball more, you have the pass protection snaps, getting lowered. and this is going to help Kadyn Proctor, get settled in and hopefully go on to have, um, great success and a, tremendous career in the NFL. The only thing with this is that, recently Jeff Stoutland, who was serving as the Eagles offensive line coach, he was here at Alabama from, 2011 to 2012. And, he had been there, for the Philadelphia Eagles ever since, 2013 and 2025. He kind of leaves his spot as the Eagles offensive line coach. So the architect kind of for bringing what this O-line is now, and, probably the guy who was responsible for the Mekhi Becton change, to playing interiorly. Like, the architect for all that is kind of gone. But like I said, to me, I think that the key nugget here and, the key important part would be that, they've done it before, so if, the new O-line coach, whoever is at the Eagles, could potentially look at that situation and essentially, play it out himself. But to me, the most important thing is just Jordan Mailata and, Kadyn Proctor just having a guy who he can go under, really study from, pick up, those nuances and pick up those, unique movements that he needs to pick on, to be good at pass protection, to be good, at run blocking, just because, they have a very similar size. They have a very similar build, very similarly in the fact that, their weight can kind of be a little bit deceiving. You would think that a guy like that, isn't that athletic. But, both guys are, very great. Kadyn Proctor is a very great prospect. And I think that Jordan Mailata, is, like I said, he's one of the best tackles doing it at the highest level of football. So I think that, that kind of, it just all, makes for, this move, where the Eagles select Kadyn Proctor, it just kind of makes sense. And so, that is it for today, guys. We'll have to wait and see where Kadyn Proctor and the rest of the Alabama guys go. Starting on the 23rd of April, running into the 25th. Ty Simpson is still, up in air for some, whether he's going to go first round or, second round, but it's definitely leading towards being a first rounder, hopefully to a good situation. I personally would ideally, love the Rams. But with the Rams playing what essentially was the pseudo Super Bowl, they're in a win now mentality, and we probably won't see this. They did address their most glaring need at cornerback, with a veteran, so that does open the door. And I'll have my fingers crossed, because they really lost, due to a failure to defend, kind of JSN and passing attacks, and being weak at corner, which everyone thought was what they were going to address in the draft, but opted to address it, via a trade. So if they do want to get Ty, they'll potentially have to trade down, because I don't think, that maybe Ty gets taken with the 13th overall pick. But I'm not getting my hopes up. It would be nice to see Ty, have a year or two under a refined and, such a sound passer like a Stafford, and being under that McVay offense. But, who knows? Parker Brailsford and Jaden Roberts are ones that I'm really interested to see where they end up, as well as Jeremy Bernard. He was making noise as a first-round pick at one point in the season, and, another guy I think that I'm keeping my eye out for is Tim Keenan. I feel like a team like the Vikings, I feel like he would slot in, pretty well playing that nose guard position and, really the defense that it was kind of had under Brian Flores up there. So we'll have to wait and see, where everyone goes, So I appreciate you guys sticking around and watching this video up to this point. This has been the Crimson Wave Report, and we'll catch you on the next surge.